You all know a famous story, A Christmas Carol, a light-hearted Christmas tale, played on TV every December. Soft music, smiling ghosts, a grumpy old man who learns to be kind. It's warm, it's familiar, it feels safe. But beneath that familiar warmth, something dark lies behind it. Because this story didn't begin as comfort. It wasn't written to make families feel cozy on the couch. It wasn't meant to be background noise while wrapping gifts. It was written to disturb. What we see today is a softened version, trimmed, polished, repackaged. What it originally was a confrontation, a ghost story, a warning, a reckoning. It was born from government reports filled with suffering, from child labour, from hunger, from a society where death wasn't rare, it was expected. Dickens didn't use fear by accident. He used it as a moral weapon. And over time, that fear was sanded down, smoothed over, turned into something easier to sell, because fear makes people uncomfortable. But comfort sells beautifully. So to understand what this story really is, what it was meant to be, we have to go back. Back to cold streets, back to candlelight, back to ghosts that weren't symbolic, but terrifyingly real. To understand this story, we have to go back to the winter of 1843. In 1843, the world Charles Dickens was staring at was not gentle. Life expectancy in England barely reached 40 years. For children, it was far worse. In many cities, nearly half never lived to see their 5th birthday. Disease moved faster than medicine: tuberculosis, cholera, smallpox. A single cough could turn into a death sentence, and families learned to listen for silence. Death wasn't hidden, it was organized. When someone died, mirrors were covered so the soul wouldn't become trapped. Clocks were stopped at the hour of death. Black crepe hung from doors. Widows wore mourning clothes for years, not weeks. Even children were dressed in black, learning grief before they learned joy. Photographs tell the rest of the story. Small, stiff portraits of children posed as if sleeping. These weren't art projects. They were often the only image a parent would ever have. Mourning wasn't an interruption of life. It was life. And then, in 1843, Dickens read something that broke him. A parliamentary report on the employment of women and children. Not opinion, not rumour, evidence. Pages of sworn testimony describing children as young as 5 working undergrounds in coal mines, crawling through tunnels barely wider than their bodies, dragging heavy carts in total darkness, working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, beaten if they slowed, starved if they failed. Factories were no better, limbs crushed in machines, lungs filled with dust, childhood replaced with exhaustion. Dickens said the report left him perfectly stricken down. He wrote that he wanted to strike the heaviest blow in my power against the cruelty he saw. But he didn't write an essay. He didn't publish statistics. He chose a story. Because stories travel further than reports. They slip past defenses. They lodge in memory. And fear. Fear lingers longer than logic ever will. So Dickens built a ghost story. Not to entertain, to accuse. This was a society built on distance. Distance between wealth and hunger. Between lawmakers and children underground. Between comfort and consequence. Scrooge speaks the language of prisons, workhouses, and surplus population, because those words were already spoken daily in Parliament. They were printed, defended, applauded. Dickens simply gave that cruelty a face, a voice, and a future. And then he forced his readers to look at it, without blinking. No escape, no sentimentality, no soft landing for anyone involved at all whatsoever here. So Dickens didn't invent Scrooge out of imagination. He assembled him from real men who already ruled England. Scrooge is often described as greedy. That description is convenient and incomplete. Greed is personal. Scrooge is ideological. He does not simply hoard money. He defends a worldview, one built on calculation, distance, and control. When Scrooge speaks about the poor, he does not sneer or shout. He classifies, he sorts, he reduces people to outcomes. Surplus population is not an insult. It is policy language, economic language. Language lifted directly from 19th century thinkers like Thomas Malthus, who argued that suffering was natural, inevitable, and even corrective. In that framework, poverty is not society's failure. It is proof that society is working. Charity becomes interference. Compassion becomes inefficiency. Empathy becomes a flaw in the system. This is why Scrooge refuses to help. Not because he lacks feeling, but because he believes helping is wrong. That belief is what makes him dangerous. Scrooge represents self-interest without accountability, profit without obligation, order without mercy. Dickens makes Scrooge extreme on purpose, not to invent a monster, but to remove every escape route for the reader. You cannot say, "I'm nothing like him," because his logic is familiar. It appears in speeches, reports, and respectable conversation. It sounds rational. It sounds clean. By pushing that logic to its endpoint, Dickens collapses it. He shows what happens when policy forgets people, when numbers replace faces, when suffering is explained instead of answered. Importantly, Dickens does not persuade with warmth. He applies pressure with clarity. Scrooge is not softened. He is exposed. The reader is forced to confront a question they would rather avoid. If this reasoning feels reasonable, how far am I willing to follow it? That recognition is the trap. Once seen, the logic cannot be unseen. It follows the reader home, into decisions, excuses, and silences. Dickens designed Scrooge so the mirror would linger, quietly, after the book closed. Long after the lights dim and the room feels again, Scrooge is not there to be hated. He is there to be recognized. And once recognition happens, the story stops being safe. And then Dickens unleashed the ghosts. The ghost of Christmas past is often softened into nostalgia, warm colours, childhood laughter, lessons learned. But Dickens never intended comfort. This spirit is trauma made visible. Scrooge is dragged backward, not invited. He is forced to witness abandonment. A child left alone in a school while others go home. Emotional neglect. Silence echoing through corridors. These memories are not gentle. They are reopened wounds. The past shows him futures that never happened. A sister who dies. A woman who leaves. A family that could have existed. Memory becomes punishment. The ghost does not heal Scrooge. It strips him. It proves that what he lost was not stolen. It was surrendered. Then comes the ghost of Christmas present, often portrayed as cheer. In truth, an audit. The Cratchit home is not sentimental. It is survival. Joy balanced on scarcity. Tiny Tim is not inspiration. He is consequence. A sick child living on borrowed time because a system refuses to help. When the spirit warns that Tim will die if nothing changes, it is not prophecy. It is cause and effect. Then the robe opens. Ignorance. Want. These are not symbolic children. They are starving, bent, wolfish. Dickens described what he had already seen. In 1843, he walked into schools and slums, children crushed by labour, hollow-eyed, disposable. Ignorance is what happens when education is denied. Want is what happens when need is punished. The warning is explicit. neglect does not remain contained. It multiplies. It turns into violence, collapse, revolution. This is not charity. It is prevention. Finally, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. No jokes, no warmth, no explanation. Silence is the weapon. Scrooge sees death without dignity, a body stripped, a grave unattended, a life erased, no mourners, no memory, no meaning. This is not hellfire. It is worse. It is social disappearance. A future where you exist only as inconvenience, where your death improves the balance sheet, where the world continues, relieved. Fear is the engine driving every vision, not spectacle, consequence. Each ghost functions like a courtroom record, evidence presented, verdicts implied, no appeal offered. Scrooge is not asked how he feels. He is shown what he caused, what he allowed, what he funded through indifference. The supernatural is merely the delivery system. The message is human. Ignore suffering, and it returns amplified. Ignore children, and the future rots. Ignore death, and it waits. Dickens understood that fear reaches places logic cannot, that dread changes behaviour faster than sermons. The ghosts do not redeem Scrooge by kindness. They corner him. They close every exit, until the only remaining option is transformation or collapse. Mercy is withheld deliberately, so responsibility cannot be avoided, postponed, softened, outsourced, or blamed on fate, circumstance, tradition, or the comfort of ignorance by anyone present at all. This is not redemption tourism. This is sentencing. Over time, A Christmas Carol didn't disappear. It was refined. Disney versions, musicals, cartoons, family films played every December. The shift didn't happen loudly. It happened gently, almost politely. What we recognize is still there. The plot survives. The ghosts arrive. Scrooge changes. The ending remains warm, generous, resolved. Redemption stays. But the pressure is gone. What modern adaptations quietly remove is context. Scrooge and Marley are not just grumpy businessmen. They are money lenders, predatory lenders to the desperate, operating in a world with no consumer protection, no regulation, no mercy. Their business model is usury, profit extracted directly from misery, debt that compounds, hope that collapses. Scrooge does not merely hoard wealth. He makes money from suffering and contributes nothing back to society. No innovation, no creation, only extraction. That matters. And it's almost always erased. In films and plays, Marley's chains still rattle, but they no longer accuse. They become visual shorthand, not moral judgment. The ghosts still appear, but they guide, not prosecute. Tiny Tim survives, without asking why he was ever in danger to begin with. Ignorance and want almost always vanish entirely. When they appear, they flicker past too quickly to disturb. Their warning that neglect breeds catastrophe is inconvenient, so it's trimmed away. Modern adaptations keep the skeleton and remove the nerves. Fear becomes spectacle. Politics dissolve into background decoration. Structural critique is replaced with personal attitude. Anger evaporates. Damnation becomes slapstick. Scrooge's transformation becomes emotional, not political, internal, not social. And that shift matters, because a miser is never mourned, never remembered, only tolerated, until he's gone. Modern versions reassure us. Dickens unsettled his readers. One comforts, the other confronts. By sanding down the fear, adaptations make the story safe. Safe for repeat viewing, safe for merchandise, safe for children. But safety was never the point. The carol endured not because it was gentle, but because it was sharp. And every time the edges are dulled, The warning grows quieter. What remains is tradition. What's lost is urgency. And yet, beneath the music and snow and softened ghosts, the original story is still there, waiting. This is the section modern versions never explain directly. A Christmas Carol is not anti-wealth. It is anti-hoarding. That distinction matters. Dickens never argued that money itself was evil. He attacked accumulation without responsibility, wealth locked away, unused, defended while people starved. That framing makes the story incredibly safe for capitalism. You are allowed to be rich. You just have to be nicer about it. Modern capitalism loves stories of individual transformation. They are clean. They don't require structural change. So Scrooge's redemption becomes personal. He feels bad. He gives money. He changes his heart. Nothing else has to change. Charity replaces justice. Donations replace accountability. Feeling generous replaces asking why suffering exists. This is where corporations step in. Disney doesn't need to deny Dickens. It simply redirects him. Guilt becomes manageable. Fear becomes festive. A moral warning becomes content. You can buy the lesson, stream it, sing along, teach it to children without ever discussing policy. The ghosts still appear, but they no longer threaten, they entertain. The story survived capitalism because it learned how to flatter it. As long as the problem is framed as personal, the system stays untouched. Scrooge changes. The world does not. And that is exactly why this story is replayed every December. It allows audiences to participate emotionally without feeling responsible. Tears replace questions. Applause replaces pressure. We leave the theatre lighter, convinced that goodness has already won. But Dickens wrote a story where goodness was delayed, fragile, and conditional. A story where change was urgent, not seasonal. Corporations keep the ending because endings sell. They remove the indictment because indictments threaten. What we inherit is a polished ritual, not a moral reckoning. The comfort is intentional. The smoothing is strategic. And once the fear is gone, the system can applaud the message without ever changing its behavior. The warning survives, but only as decoration, not as a threat. That is why Scrooge is lovable, and the system he served remains invisible, unquestioned, and intact. Every December, we applaud change and forget the cost. The world Dickens wrote about no longer exists, but the fear he tapped into does. Today, we are not haunted by workhouses or debtors' prisons. We are haunted by emptiness, by isolation that hides behind productivity, by lives measured in output instead of meaning. We fear becoming useful, and nothing else. Scrooge still works because he reflects a modern anxiety, the terror of being efficient but unloved, successful but forgotten, surrounded by people, yet fundamentally alone. We recognize him because we see versions of him everywhere, in overworked managers, in inboxes that never sleep, in systems that reward exhaustion and call it virtue. Even softened adaptations resonate because the fear underneath remains intact. The music may change, the edges may blur, but the question lingers. What happens if this is all there is? What happens if your life ends quietly and no one feels the loss? That fear hasn't faded. It has just changed its uniform. Scrooge isn't frightening because he's cruel. He's frightening because he's empty, because he traded connection for control, and won, and still lost. That is why audiences return every year, not for comfort, for reassurance. Because somewhere beneath the snow and songs, we fear becoming him. A Christmas Carol was never meant to be cozy. It was meant to interrupt, It arrived as a shock, not a tradition, a warning, not a ritual. We softened it because it worked too well, because fear changes behavior, and uncomfortable stories don't sell forever. So we wrapped it in music. We turned ghosts into mascots. We taught children a version that wouldn't unsettle adults. But the warning never vanished. It only went quiet. Beneath the carols, beneath the warmth, the original story still waits, waiting to ask the same question it always did. What kind of life are you building? And who will pay the cost if you refuse to change? Lore unlocked doesn't mean nostalgia. It means remembering what was hidden on purpose. Because the ghosts were never meant to scare children. They were meant to scare adults who believed nothing would ever come to collect. If this story changed the way you see something familiar, that's not an accident. These stories weren't meant to soothe. They were meant to wake us up. If you want more truths hidden in plain sight, more forgotten meanings, more warnings we were never supposed to forget, subscribe. Because comfort is easy to find, understanding is not. And there are many more stories waiting to be unlocked.